Hello again. We're going to have to go to the second half of our event. And I think our logical next speaker is Bob Held. I think Bob's on the stage. So if you can turn your mic on and camera on, Bob. Thank you.
Oops. Sorry, I had my cap on.
You're there.
Okay, thanks, Vic. Yeah, I've had a few discussions. I'm going to apologize in advance for if I misrepresented what we had talked about at the tables. But again, some of these might be my own, but I think they kind of encapsulate it. I don't have much to say except a bunch of motherhood statements, but it's all kind of couched around our access to data and our ability to quickly analyze it. We're in a fairly diverse and changing environment, whether it's the force and the risks that are in front of us, and also the policies that are in front of us that we're dealing with today. And these aren't, I'm not just focusing policies here with government or legislators, it's also industry and other policymakers that are out there from sort of the analyst perspective that give us the parameters in which we work. Moving forward, there's also the discussions got into whether we are risk adverse or non-risk adverse. I think we can all think that industry is probably on the less risk adverse end of the scale, and maybe government on the other side. The questions there is then how do you define the risk, and does that risk change relative to where you're working within the province? Obviously, some risks do change, and it would sort of lean to maybe some decentralization of those definitions and make sure that we're not throwing everything into one basket. With these changing policies all the time, what can happen, with the changing in our environments, you know, how dynamic things are with all the risks in front of us, we as industry and government put a lot of effort into finding a land base and maybe yields. With one fell swoop of policy, we've all of a sudden lost a huge opportunity in our AAC gains in timber supply. Good example is what's on our doorstep now with herbicide, that if this does come forward, we have very little data and very little argument to fight what any reduction might be, and we end up with some policy somewhere that would maybe not necessarily be the right answer. So we need to be ready to react to these as they come forward, because I think there's going to be more and more of these as we get challenged as we work on the public lands. So with that, we need to make sure that we have data at our fingertips, ready to go, as accurate as possible relative to the scale we're working on, whether that's at a strategic, tactical, operational, or even at the research level, which we can't ignore that we need that information. And be ready to analyze it and challenge decisions as they come forward with good data and not some personal agenda. Again, I think I've heard it here quite a bit, is that sometimes policies get in our way, and we need to be able to reduce, or we can see it, we need to be able to change or reduce policies, given our staffing levels are always decreasing, and with that is maybe some reduced oversight, and then put more responsibility and accountability on our people that are ultimately responsible for implementing forest management plans or whatever plan that might be. Arguably, this will take time. It takes a lot of time for change to happen. Kind of counters everything I just said, but I believe here that time is of the essence, and we need to start making change so we can do what's best for the forest and for our industry. I think that's all I have, Vic. They're pretty motherhood, not much detail, but again, as analytically, we as analysts do what we're told, but we need to do it quickly.
Okay, thanks, Bob. And our next reporter would be John Parkins. John, are you on the stage? We may have missed John. In that case, we'll skip him for now and we'll go on to Neil McLaughlin, if Neil's there.
I'm back.
Thank you, Neil.
Yep. To remind everyone, the topic discussion I led was related to the landscapes on fire presentation and challenges related to fire. I posed 4 questions to each of the groups that I discussed that topic with. And I just want to shout out to all the folks that were having technical difficulties. Thanks for hanging in there and using the chat feature and getting your comments in. We're all learning this platform at the same time, but you did great, and thanks for contributing. So to summarize the comments around the 4 questions that I posed, the first question was related to what challenges do our teams in Alberta pose to future timber supply and forest management. This is likely the area I had the most comments on. I'll just run through a couple. We had an agreement that fuel loads and even age forest conditions are fueling uncontrollable fires. There's increased uncertainty on what timber will be available in both the short and long term. And we are having challenges predicting when and where fires will occur. And in doing so, differentiating between good fire and destructive fire. So how do we assess risk levels? Some species composition might be changing in certain ecosystems and creating fire behavior that's outside of our experience with respect to management, with respect to suppression, with respect to our predictive ability. And it could also be resulting in novel ecosystems post-disturbance. How do we effectively manage risk through the detailed forest management planning process? And is the spatial harvest sequence enough? Is it the appropriate scale? Maybe 1 or 2 more. Area-based tenure. It was a good investment initially for stability in terms of an investment for industry, but it may be resulting in unfair or discrepant realities as fire impacts some companies more than others. So there's a notion that the tenure system is no longer fair and equitable. Moving to the next question, and keeping in mind there's many other comments which I'll pass along to Vic and company, but the next question was, what are the worst things we could do? And really quickly, doing nothing or the status quo rose to the top. Government's not providing consistent direction or enabling change. Managing conflicting priorities. So the example given was maintaining old age classes, which are most conducive to catastrophic fire, to meet caribou protection priorities. But there's others. Managing for a single priority. Maybe timber supply is an example of managing for a single priority. Not looking at other jurisdictions and heeding their lessons learned. We heard some of those lessons in our opening presentation from Jeff. And not acting quickly. The notion that we truly have to do more with less and faster. These fire regimes are not slowing down. Moving to the last 2 questions, what proactive measures could we take to make a difference? One of the comments was that timber salvage is probably going to be a much bigger player going forward. Creating value in different stand types and different kinds of bioeconomies, different types of forest utilization, and monetizing those different values and forms of utilization. Thinking about things we haven't done before. Jasper might be setting the way in that regard, where they're logging in a national park and conducting large-scale fuel management, which typically wouldn't have been associated with national parks. Assisted species migration to maybe modify fuel conditions. And a really big one within all of the groups was education and awareness, changing perceptions. The notion that fire historically was used as a management tool, but has become an enemy, and we maybe need to bring it back as a management tool. finally, we looked for players that could help enable that change. And so we listed several, and these won't be unfamiliar, but focusing on maybe roles that they could show up in enabling or implementing change. So governments of all levels are certainly enabling or not. There are real policy barriers. We felt that public education plays a critical role in that regard. The public can pressure politicians and sway popular opinion and create that more societal change. Politicians themselves can resist change and can revert systems to old practices, but they can also be instrumental in enabling quick policy reform, incentivizing change, providing new or different government services and programs, developing accountability on the delivery of those programs, and setting performance expectations. Forest industry plays a role. Again, they can lobby government to make the change or not, and they can show up in terms of an innovative engine for implementing those changes. First Nations, by and large, likely support the return of using prescribed fire as a tool and how it aligns with traditional uses. So we might have advocates and an ally there. Finally, there was a suggestion to kind of enable the change from above, but implement it from the grassroots. Concluding thoughts, I've imparted a car analogy for this one. Climate change is like putting a more powerful engine in the car. This climate engine is what propels our fire regimes forward, and the car is now moving very fast, and our brakes are insufficient to slow it down. The forests are equivalent to the amount and type of fuel we put into the engine. And right now, Alberta is valuing a continuous supply of high-octane fuels. But I want to impart as a final comment that the forest industry does have direct control and influence on engine combustion. Forestry can moderate how far the car can travel based on how much fuel we provide to the engine, and they can shift to lower grade fuels potentially to reduce engine performance. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Vic.
Thank you very much. Sounds like you had a good table, a lot of discussions. Our next reporter is Barb Thomas.
Hi, Vic.
Hello.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to just stick to a few key points that were brought up in our sessions. Our 3 sessions were all very different, which was great. There was a contingent of government, industry, consultants, nursery experts, breeders, and students that participated across the 3 different sessions. And I definitely feel that more discussion could go on after this. I thought we just started to touch on some pretty key elements. So these are some of the points. It was viewed that tree improvement is in fact critical for our ability to adapt to climate change, and other people might see that as assisted migration that would fit into the same wheelhouse, and that fiber security outweighs just a concern for return on investment value. Those were 2 really key, very solid thoughts out of my group. Another one is that tree improvement use is constrained by policies that drive pure species stand management. You can't maximize mixed species use and therefore the use out of the seed orchards. So this no doubt permeates a number of different scenarios that different companies face. And it's not a particularly new problem, but it is bleeding heavily into tree improvement now, since you can't get approval of gain in mixed stands. A 4th one, which sort of dovetails in with silviculture issues, the challenges of trying to combine tree improvement with commercial thinning. A lot of that's driven by cost, not surprisingly, and also access to those stands. So who benefits from the engagement in the thinning? can the mill in fact take the commercial thinnings that come out? Another area raised was that it does appear to be an opportunity to coordinate efforts and activities at the provincial level for tree improvement. One area to think about this in particular is seed movement and addressing back to the climate change issue and whether or not the orchards you manage and look after are appropriate for your region any longer. And then something that was also said earlier was this issue of frequency of disturbance going up and reforestation on those sites. So one of the considerations is that shorter turnaround period. If you have faster growing trees, you may be able to get a crop off essentially before the next fire interval comes through, even if it is shorter. So again, it could have benefits in terms of addressing those issues. And then there was a bit of discussion also around social approval, which feeds into, you know, the social license to operate issues. Where does that collide with tree improvement, or does it? And use of other technologies, again, back to silviculture, use of herbicides in terms of maximizing that benefit. Seed procurement, the opportunity to adjust to changes in societal demands and the flexibility that might be afforded by having seed and storage from your orchards that has wider deployment opportunities. So I think I'll stop there. I just wanted to make a few key points. I may not have captured every part of our discussions, but those were the main ones.
Thank you, Barb. The next reporter is Devin Goodsman. Mic on, please. Thank you.
I presided over the table that discussed insect management approaches. And there were three main themes that came out in our discussions, and they were spread across the three discussion groups. The first was brainstorming approaches to management and ways of evaluating their efficacy. And then the second, considering the impacts on timber supply, which is evident, and then considering impacts on ecosystems and non-timber values. And so I'll go through each of these. Some approaches that came up were using a continuous cover regime in order to control populations or mitigate damage. And so, as well as to hedge against the potential for complete loss of timber supply. And so this we had discussed, and to our knowledge in the table at least, it hadn't been addressed with mountain pine beetle, and we're not sure with other species of insects. So it could be an area of future research. We also talked about different approaches of thinning, of course. Beetle proofing always comes up in these discussions, very intensive thinning. It's something that I always bring up is also thinning from above. And we had some discussion about situations in which thinning from above might be efficacious and situations where it wouldn't. And considering removing the stigma that's associated with so-called high grading, it might be considered, if we could remove that stigma, it could be considered beneficial in certain situations. Moving on to the second theme, considering impacts on timber supply. So it arose in several discussions that we need to consider different management approaches and how they might impact fiber, and how they may impact the continuity of supply. Log quality, for example, in some of the severely thinned regions in BC, there was a report that there was loss of some log quality. And so this is a concern and something that potentially needs to be addressed when considering managing insects. It's one of the trade-offs. And then finally, the last theme, considering impacts on ecosystem and non-timber values. And in our last discussion, this was very much emphasized. So one of the things that we considered in depth were caribou and impacts of and other invasive species. And one of the important points that was brought up was the ecological impact of different types of control. So the level 1 control, the proactive cutting and burning of individual trees and clusters of trees at the invasion front is relatively low impact compared to clear cutting or prescribed burning behind the invasion front. And so this is something that needs to be considered. Other things that we spoke about was we're using a variety of management approaches in order to sort of exploit insect outbreaks to return diversity to the landscape. So it's diversity both in age and in species assortments in different regions. And then we discussed the sort of the policy implications and the planning that is done. It tends to be done on a 10-year interval, and different regions have different priorities, which will lead to a mosaic of different different management approaches used on the landscape. So in the end, a sort of overriding and summarizing theme would be the necessity of considering a multitude of different management options, which is promising in terms of motivating future research to sort of develop alternatives to what we're currently using. That's everything.
Thank you, Devin. That was good. So if you have any questions, send them in. Our next presenter is Brad Pino from the university. Thanks, Brad.
All right. So in our group, we were talking about silviculture. So I'll kind of quickly go over some of the topics that we hit on, some of the common themes throughout them, and a couple other ideas that got mentioned. But I'll start with one that came up in each of the groups, and that was the use of herbicides. This is a common tool in silviculture now, and in many cases, as we move towards more intensive silviculture, herbicide use it becomes very common. So the discussion is this, how do we gain public acceptance for this? There's lots of concerns around glyphosate nowadays. How do we get public acceptance of herbicide use, or what are some of the alternatives to herbicides? Things like that. That was a big part of the discussion. And in broader, branched out into just general public perceptions of intensive management is what do we want from our forests? How do we link that with other goals from the landscape? We're talking mostly about timber supply today, but what about the other goals from the landscape, whether it's wildlife habitat or fire protection, all those really important things? How do we get that from silviculture as well? So then our discussion kind of moved into how do we where are some areas that we're going to get multiple benefits from, right? So where can we get timber supply benefits, growth and yield benefits, as well as other benefits? And the one that kind of came up a few times was the potential for density management, meeting timber supply needs, meeting fire reduction goals, perhaps meeting climate change adaptation goals, drought tolerance, that sort of thing. Lots of potential with that tool, I believe. Another big part of our discussion was linking silviculture to tree improvement and growth and yield modeling. We often think of them as kind of separate sections, but in reality, I think we all know that they're really linked and all part of the same thing here. So the other part of it was part of the challenge with intensive silviculture is, accurately predicting and validating yields that you're going to get out at different times in the future. And I think there was a recognition that we're not going to be able to, wait around and just watch the trees grow to see how much volume we're going to get in the end. We're going to need some tools to be able to help us predict that accurately. So, tree level and stand level growth and yield models are going to become critical as we move into this. We won't be able to rely on past growth to project the future growth, that sort of idea, right? Another part that we went into was moving silviculture out of the realm of just reforestation to kind of moving whole rotation type silviculture, right? So it doesn't stop when we do regen surveys or performance surveys. Silviculture, we need to be thinking about it throughout the whole rotation, mid-rotation as well, not just at reforestation. Some of the other things we did touch on zoning and kind of this idea of, is that appropriate? Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't, but it was an interesting discussion that we had. But in general, there's this idea is how do we decide where, what's the decision-making model for how much intensive management we're going to do, where on the landscape are we going to do it, and then how do we get everybody to kind of get on board with this land management goal. Yeah, the other thing I guess I would say is, in general, there was pretty good recognition, I think, from all of the discussions that we had, that there really is huge potential in Alberta for growing trees fast. So the potential for intensive silviculture in Alberta is huge. And a lot of what the tools that we would need for this, we already have available. We're pretty good at silviculture. We're pretty good at regenerating and growing trees and forests. The real challenges are going to become, like we've heard from everybody else today, but more on the policy, the public perception, the scaling up of this across the landscape. Those are going to be our real challenges as we move forward with this. But I think that's kind of a quick summary of the different topics that we had at the silviculture table.
Thanks, Brad. That was a good summary. I think I'm going to call Ted to the stage now, and maybe I think John Parkins is no longer in the room. I think he's been called away. That's the impression I got. He's been called away to other duties, being chair of the department. So I'd like to bring Ted back up to the stage. And we had a really good overview from a whole bunch of people showing great complexity, significant barriers, significant large numbers of players making decisions. Maybe you got some insights that you could think of in terms of the summary for the day here. And maybe I'd like to, at the end, I'd like to talk about a little bit about where we could go next. How would we change things if we're going to change things and move forward? What's the process?
All right. Thanks, Vic. Maybe just watch out if any of the chat questions come up. So I would encourage people to, if they have something they want to bring forth, put it up on the chat, and we can discuss it here too. I try to take some quick notes. Very first thing I wrote down, no one said the exact words like this, but we talked about it a lot, is that the past is not the future. So it was reinforced in a lot of the talks and a lot of the challenges. So if that's not the case, it would challenge everyone to think about where all our policies and tools that we currently use, what are they based upon? And if you think about it, from foresters, the first thing we do is we go measure trees and track them for a long period of time. So there's a fundamental weakness if we say that's not the conditions those trees grew under is not what we're dealing with going forward. So I think that theme is important and probably came up a lot throughout the conversation today.
Ted, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Now, is the sustained yield management system that we've been using for the last 150 years and we've embraced very vigorously in Western Canada, is this holding us back from fixing that problem?
Well, that's an awful loaded question because the sustained yield, as you call it, management system is put in place through a series of policies and how those policies are applied. So there's perhaps more flexibility than our people choose to use. But essentially that process of in Alberta has been until very recently, even flow timber, let's make sure we can still do the same things 50 or 100 years from now that we do today. And that's an underlying tenet. And given how things change rapidly, not just in the environment, but in the manufacturing end and whatever products people are going to want out of the forest, who knows what it's going to be. It doesn't mean we shouldn't look at long-term implications, but how much influence should long-term implications have on today's decision is really the I think where we need to go, because that's really what we're faced with.
But long-term meaning 200 years?
50 years.
50 years. That's a different planning horizon, though.
I mean, I'll be dead in 50 years unless they come up with a new miracle drug on something. So it's actually a long time out. Foresters think of that 100 years. That's nothing. We just think of that. The reality is certain things you have some confidence in and other ones we don't. So we don't in our current planning processes deal with fire, other than if you happen to have a large fire in your forest management unit very recently, that area it gets removed. So it's variable. The fire loss is variable. Whether you should and whether you can plan for something that stochastically or you simply inherently have to adapt with it. There are people with different views on that. I'm in the latter. I don't think you can, in many cases, you simply can't deal with it. You simply have to adapt. You don't have a choice. But that means that the assumption everything will stay stable for a long period of time is a faulty assumption.
Tim Vinge is bringing up the point that we're not modeling new silvicultural systems to evaluate in terms of wood flow for the long term. And how do you feel about that statement?
I know we've done it in some. The new silviculture systems, I'm not sure what he means necessarily by new. We, in most cases, have at most two that I'm aware of. There would be a mixed wood management one, and there would be a clear cut one. The mixed wood management would have an entry, two entries in it.
Well, I could think of a couple of wood being, meaning partial harvesting of some sort, like an uneven edge management or thinning regimes.
We put them in. It's not to say they've never been in, but again, it's can they actually be implemented on where you think they can be, and what confidence do you have in the outcomes that might come from that?
We have another question from Yuha, 1970. What kind of predictions were made then about 2020? That's a nasty question, Yuha.
One of the neat things that I think is really appropriate in the modeling world is you set yourself up for embarrassment and failure when you make predictions over the long period of time. And perhaps the best thing to do is to have people go back and look at them and point out what an idiot you were. But if you don't force yourself to make predictions, and the more accurate with more detail you make it very explicit predictions, they're easier to pick apart to find out why you went wrong. But let's make them and let's see where they stand up and where they don't. But I know if you look at the yield curves that were used, compared them to the yield curves now, the natural yield curves based on sampling, in many cases there are huge differences. So I haven't attempted to determine why they're so different. Part of it could be disturbance activities, and a lot of that is human disturbance activities, anthropogenic ones, taking the better parts out. But those curves have shifted even if you use the same methodology to build them. So something's changed. Well, more than some things. If you watch, if you want to watch for questions there, Vic.
Marty Alexander's asking how wrong the models have to be useful and still be useful if they're partially wrong. When are they no longer useful?
So I guess that I didn't know this would turn into a question period for Ted, but if that's where we're going.
Yeah, it seems that way. Maybe.
My thought is they're all useful. It's what you, it's what, how you want to take that outcome and apply it. So a very simple model will tell you something. But again, if it's based on an underlying assumption, which is very, very faulty, and you've got rid of all of the details, so you can't determine why the answer was wrong. So simple models suffer that problem. But if a model is drastically wrong, like what's my income going to be next year, that seems to be things that don't work, then, or what's the interest rate? We seem to never get that one right. When we really matter at the fine level of resolution, that's important. Still, if you don't make the prediction, you don't have to ever assemble the assumptions. And I would always argue the assumptions are far more important than the outcome. So you can clearly state what those assumptions are, because it will challenge you to determine what confidence you will have in the individual assumption, which determines value.
I interrupted you, and we've all interrupted you with these questions. Maybe you'd like to summarize a few more points.
Well, I just had some other ones I wrote down what people talked about earlier. The main one I really got to was that, things are changing. Look at other jurisdictions. I think that's important. We are not reinventing the wheel here. We really don't have to. We have a little bit more time to deal with some of the challenges that are coming at us. Some of our challenges are somewhat unique, but our forest is by and large a little behind the disturbance levels of many of the other forests around us. So we have more time, although there are some FMUs that have already sort of they're in the bottom of that a trough of wood supply right now. So there's examples in the province, but outside the province is worth looking, and outside the country, how other jurisdictions have dealt with these challenges.
Got a question here from Bob Martin. Did you see it, Ted? It's key constraint in AAC is the requirement for non-declining even flow over a long planning horizon of 200 years. We can only dream of being so good as to predict that long, given the changing nature of the forest, fires, insects, societal values. So we're playing that game. No question that we are. What can we do? What can we do to implement change? And I would make a note that I've been doing a little bit of researching on sustained yield management, and Western Canada seems to be one of the most conservative places in the world in terms of the way we implement sustained yield management. So, just a comment.
And I think that came up throughout much of the discussion, and even that was summarized today. I think as foresters, we tend to take it and put it in areas that we understand, but how challenges related to fire, for instance, which we don't put in a timber supply analysis to set ACs, but we are good at thinking about what that is, what intent it could be, and even if need be, forecasting what that disturbance will look like.
In my section, we had a section, we're running out of time, and I'd like to bring in one more set of ideas. In my section, we talked about barriers to change and what could we do to improve or make some changes in the way we manage our forest. And I think we're all in this together, industry, government, and academics. And academics we have to take our full share of any blames of where we are in terms of having the system we got in place, because we teach the darn stuff. So what could we do to change things?
So I didn't hear a lot of today, a lot of solutions about what to do to change it. We did hear about some of the areas where it's more constraining. It went all the way from targeting the audience. If it's about changing policies and procedures, defining that audience and what is that appropriate audience, how is that communicated? Then being clear about who the policymakers are, which would be the target audience.
Nadine Peterson is bringing up a point about replanning as a process for correcting some of these changes that are occurring in our system. If we have any comments to make on that issue. Replanning is incredibly important in the current forest management policy in Alberta.
That's a good point, and thanks, Nadine. That was brought up at my table a couple of times on the planning, replanning, the frequency of it, and what that impacts. So I'm trying to think of some of the examples that off the top of my head that were used, but we have a 10-year process, and a particular outcome of that is the spatial harvest sequence. So we talked about planning processes that are going to have to be more adaptable, so that you have the ability to deal with the disturbances, especially if salvage is more important, which was also brought up today. So if salvage activities are going to be more important, how can you deal with that, making sure you don't go outside your other triggers that are important for forest management. So perhaps a shorter planning cycle that's not nearly as comprehensive and in depth as the one that we do today might be required, because the current one would be too long if you had to redo that every year, considering plans take 2 years.
You made the statement about skills to sell change within an organization or between organizations. And Sina would like to expand upon that, I guess.
Yeah, so I think the key point there, we were actually talking about policy, and it was really key that it's, when you talk about this policy, it's not just government policy, it's corporate or institutional policies. And to have that enacted, you often run into a number of barriers. So understanding those barriers and understanding how to either address them or deal with them, and what tools do you need, because that's quite often different than most of us would deal with in our forestry life. And that's where the benefits that can be clearly articulated and well defended are required. If you can't do that, you're unlikely to have success, especially if it's new and different, because you're going to run into that inertia to change.
And maybe Barb Thomas's question is important. The red tape reduction program that the GOA recently implemented to remove policy constraints in forestry. What impact has it had, and what was done? And maybe there's other people, better people to answer that.
Probably better than me to answer where that one is.
There's a string of them coming in. the different levels of risk tolerance with the forest within the forest sector as a whole represent a barrier to moving forward.
Is that actually a question or just a well understood yes?
I don't think there's any doubt. Government and industry have different levels of risk tolerance.
And both of them represent barriers. They have different levels and different types of risk tolerance.
Yeah. Aaron Cook says numerous changes to the Forest Act are going to cabinet soon. Be interesting to know what those are. Maybe we'll have to. We'll be watching for those.
And some of that came up today too. Was hinted on, anyways.
Presented to the AFPA. Interesting. So we've run out of time. We've run out of time, and I don't want to stop the conversations. The tables will be open. I'm going to stop this discussion and thank Ted and all the speakers and all the presenters. And Jeff is going to show you a picture of the gift that you're going to get. So we'll stop there, and I would like to have everybody leave the stage and have Jeff and Julie and Lindsay come onto the stage to be recognized. Thank you.